Hello and welcome to the fifth and final installment of FTCOE's Society of Forensic Anthropology webinar collaboration series. For today's webinar, we have Dr. Heather Edgar and Dr. Becca George presenting Dental Morphology, the Informative but Lesser-Known Traits. The Q&A session will be moderated by Michaela Askeles, a forensic scientist at RTI International. Without further delay, here are Dr. Edgar and Dr. George.
Thank you so much for having Becca and I. We're really looking forward to this presentation. We hope you will find it helpful. So let's start with some background about why we're having this conversation about dental morphology at all. And as you are often taught in classes, teeth preserve better than bone. But why specifically are we going to talk today mostly about molars? Well, that's because, first of all, molars tend to preserve better in situ than other dentition in forensic contexts. In general, teeth are evolutionary conservative, so they're resistant to change, and that makes them more informative for ancestry estimation than cranial measurements. Cranial measurements are more susceptible to environmental or plastic changes, including taphonomic changes. And then also considering teeth, there are many heritability estimates available for a lot of different dental traits, not all of them, but many of them. So in today's webinar, we're going to discuss molar traits that are less well known than some of the more commonly discussed traits, but that are really informative for ancestry estimation. So how about some orientation kind of to the way we talk about traits? The ones we're going to talk about are currently in use are in methods that draw upon dental morphology for the forensic estimation of population affinity specifically. They're also used for biodistance and bioarchaeology and other studies, but we're here to talk about for their forensic use. In describing the traits, they're often used, we use abbreviations to describe them. So U is the abbreviation for maxillary, and L is the abbreviation for mandibular, and then M is the abbreviation for molar, since we have so many things that are actually starting with M. 1, 2, or 3 describes tooth number, and then there's usually a 2-letter code for a trait, 2 or more letters to describe a trait name. So for example, UM1CB would be maxillary molar 1, or first molar, Carabelli's trait. The teeth that we're going to be looking at are these circled in orange. So those are maxillary molars 1 and 2. We're not going to talk about M3s. And we're going to talk about mandibular molars 1 and 2. And I noticed the orientation here. So when we're talking about the maxilla, the right is going to be on the left side, but if we're talking about the mandible, it's the left that's on the left side. And all the examples that you're going to be given are going to be right maxillary teeth and left mandibular teeth. So here's a little orientation to molars in general for reference. You've got those previous graphs up on the upper right. And then if we look at that maxillary right molar, so that means that the buccal side is to the left of your screen as you're looking at it, and the lingual is on the right. Mesial is the front, towards the front of the mouth, distal is in the back of the mouth. There's 4 primary cusps to that molar. And they have these scientific names: protocone, paracone, metacone, and hypocone, but you can also describe them by their cusp number, 1, 2, 3, 4. And in the maxillary molar, it kind of makes sense because they run counterclockwise. But you can also, it's longer words, but easier placement to talk about where they are on the tooth. So the protocone is the mesiolingual cusp, and the mesiobuccal cusp is paracone, and so on. Now in the mandible, so again, we're looking here at a left tooth. And so it remains that the buccal is on the left-hand side of your screen and the lingual is on the right-hand side of the screen, with the mesial towards the front top of the screen and the distal towards the bottom. There are 5 primary cusps. You don't always have cusp 5, but it's common enough that we consider it a primary cusp. And again, they're 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, but they're in a different placement. And so, and they have names: protoconid, metaconid, hypoconid, entoconid, and the hypoconulid. But again, you can describe them just by the location on the tooth, and those don't change, and you can reconstruct those. If you can't remember what cusp number it is, and you can't remember the scientific name, you can always describe it by where it is on the tooth. And now let me provide you just a little bit of orientation to the trait descriptions and the sheet that, or the format of the descriptions. So this is a page out of a manual that I put together that you don't have to study teeth, but is available to you. And so it provides you the name of the trait and that abbreviation. And it provides you probably the single most useful thing is this little drawing up here kind of in the upper right-hand corner of the page. And that shows you where you're going to look for the variation that is of interest with whatever trait you're discussing. So there'll always be like a little circle that'll be like, oh, this is the part of the tooth that you want to look at. And then next to that is the detailed trait description. So it's the overall description of trait of like where it is found and the basic variation. So here we're talking about the Carabelli's trait on the second molar. And so it can be a groove or a pit or a complex groove or an accessory cusp, and just a little more information about it. And then each one of the possible trait descriptions, all the different levels that it could be, is described in 3 ways. First, a wordy description, and then second, a drawing of like a perfect version, a perfect expression of the trait, and then a couple of real world photos to give you some ideas about how it can vary. And I'm going to pass this on now to Becca so she can talk to you about some traits you already know something about.
All right. So before we jump into all of the really important molar traits that Heather and I wanted to talk about in terms of ancestry estimation in a forensic context, we wanted to touch on some of the more common traits that usually come up either in forensic casework or things that traits that we tend to see appear in forensic anthropological work outside of strictly dental morphology. So the first of those is shoveling, of course, which I suspect many of you are familiar with. So shoveling is scored on the maxillary and mandibular central and lateral incisors, as well as the canines. And we just have some pictures here to go along with the descriptions, along with the scores. So those scores are actually on the teeth or within the photos as we move through this PowerPoint that kind of shows you how we would score these teeth based on the trait descriptions. So for shoveling, it's scored 0 to 6, with 7 in the maxillary dentition being a barrel shaped. The mandibular dentition is actually scored as 0 to 3, and this is because shoveling isn't as pronounced within the lower dentition as it is in the maxillary dentition. Shoveling tends to be pretty useful in terms of ancestry estimation because it's one of the traits that we actually have a genetic link for. So shoveling is associated with the EDAR allele, which is linked to hair thickness and several other things within groups that have roots in Northern Asia. And this, of course, includes Native Americans as well as Hispanic or Latinx groups. Another common trait that comes up is Carabelli's trait or Carabelli's cusp, as you may have heard it called. So we are calling it Carabelli's trait because it encompasses more than just that cusp. There's quite a few variations with this. So Carabelli's trait is a molar trait. It's actually scored in all 3 of the maxillary molars, with the most pronounced expressions usually being on the first molar. So Carabelli's trait is scored from 0 to 7, and this ranges from that smooth mesiolingual cusp, which would be a 0, to a full-blown extra cusp that actually has a free apex, and that is shown as a 7 in the photos that we have here, as well as in the trait descriptions. And in terms of ancestry estimation, we've all kind of usually been taught that Carabelli's trait is most pronounced in European groups, but in reality, those are where we just see the most pronounced expressions of Carabelli's traits. There are very strong Carabelli's cusps that can be found in groups with Asian roots as well, which includes, of course, our Native American and Hispanic or Latinx groups as well. But it's not just in European groups. So we are continually finding out more information about kind of the global frequencies of some of these traits, and Carabelli's is one of those. And now I will hand it back to Heather to go through some of our molar traits.
Okay, so this is the new stuff. These are the molar traits that are less frequently known or less frequently taught, especially if you don't have a dental anthropologist at the school where you were trained. These are ones you might not have been exposed to very often, but that are really, really useful. So we're going to start in the maxilla and then move on to the mandible. And the first trait I'm going to talk about is the maxillary metacone. So this is that distobuccal cusp on the tooth, and what you're really looking at is the size of that cusp in comparison to the mesiobuccal cusp. That's what it is how big is it compared to the other cusp. So if we look here, this is the cusp that we're interested in, that distobuccal cusp, and this is the cusp we're comparing it to, the mesiobuccal cusp. And so you can, all you're doing is comparing the size. And so in like this level, that's really, really a common one, that's size, that's score 4. The metacone is just a bit smaller, about 2/3 the size of the mesiobuccal cusp. And then we can look at this one where this size 5, also a really common one, and the two cusps are approximately the same. And if we look here, you can see that the metacone is larger than the mesiobuccal cusp. So that's the basics of it. It's just comparing one cusp to the other. We do the exact same thing here. This is the second molar. And what we find is that, first of all, second molars tend to be smaller overall and have smaller expression of all of these different cusps. And so if we look, it's the same kind of thing. 4 here, the score 4 means that this cusp is about 2/3 the size of this cusp. And here they're approximately the same size, marked in number 5. And then with number 6, it's actually a little bit larger. And in general, what we find as far as population variation is that that European and European-derived populations tend to have simpler teeth, so lower scores of kind of everything that we're going to be talking about. Oh, I did want to bring to your attention, especially this version of the tooth. So what we're looking at here is a normal variant. This is an M2, maxillary M2, that has no metacone. And so that's where we would be looking, is just in that particular location. There's basically no metacone there. It ends up with this kind of awkward looking tooth that seems really diagonal and compared to the other teeth around it generally. And so this expression is relatively rare. I don't know if I can give you an exact number of the percentage of people who have it. It is more common in European groups. So if you see this is a normal variant. Okay, moving on. Now we're going to look at the hypocone. So instead of looking at the distobuccal cusp, we're going to look at the distolingual cusp. And that's what that little drawing up at the top is showing you, is we're looking at the lingual cusp. And so if we look here, this is that cusp. You can always tell the hypocone because it's kind of got this groove that goes at an angle compared to the rest of the tooth that separates the hypocone from the whole rest of the tooth. And so it's easy to find the hypocone. And once you find that hypocone, you know that it's distolingual, so you can orient the tooth. So we're looking at the relationship of this cusp in size to this cusp. And so in a score 4, again, a really common score, here it's a moderate sized cusp, which means that it is almost as large as the mesiolingual cusp. And then here in 5, they would be approximately the same size. And then in 6, it's actually larger. The hypocone would be larger than the mesiolingual cusp. Now, I wanted to use this example specifically because you'll notice that this tooth has a really large Carabelli's cusp. That's the cusp that's on the lingual side there. And that's not included in the comparison of the hypocone to the other cusp. All right, and here we are looking at the same trait again, hypocone, but here on the second molar, the presentation is a little bit different only because the tooth is smaller and tends to be simpler. So a variant that you might see relatively commonly is a 0 score. This is actually what I have in my own mouth. So, it's a simple version of it. So here we have no hypocone. That little cuspule that you see there is actually a cusp 5, and there's no hypocone at all when we compare it to the mesiolingual cusp. And then here in the middle, we see a score 2. So it's kind of a small hypocone. There's one there, but it's a lot smaller than the comparison cusp. And then if we look at score 4 at the bottom, it's almost as large. We could argue about whether this is a 3 or 4, but I'm comfortable with saying it's a 4. Now let's take a look at the metaconnual. Now this is, it's called metaconnual. It's also called cusp 5. And here we're going to look in between the metacone and the hypocone and in the groove that's there and see if there's any cusp. So that fifth cusp is not always present in the maxilla, or even mostly present in the maxilla. So we're looking right here in this groove. And this score of 0, well, that's because the groove reaches all the way to the edge of the tooth. And so there is no cusp there. And that is a score of 0 for the metaconnual. If we look at the next tooth, we're going to see now we have kind of a cusp, a cuspule. And so once we have one, then we're going to compare it to the distal buccal cusp in size. And so score 2 is going to be the case where it's the metaconnual, the little cuspule in question, is about the quarter of the size of the distal buccal cusp. And then a score 4 would be one where it's about 1/3 to 1/2 the size. It's usually pretty small, so getting to 1/3 to 1/2 the size of the distal buccal cusp means it's a pretty big expression. Again, just because the trait ends up looking a little bit different, we can look at it on the second molar. Here we again have score 0 because the groove reaches all the way to the edge with no interruption. Here we're comparing it to size, but you can see there's nothing to compare. And then I'll direct your attention specifically to the expression at the bottom, number 4. That's a pretty good size one. It looks like a big metaconnual, but again, it's between 1/3 and 1/2 the size of the distal buccal cusp. And I think I'm going to turn this over to Becca once again.
So we are going to shift from looking at the occlusal surface of the tooth to looking at the buccal surface of the maxillary molars. And we are starting with a trait called peristyle. So this has a kind of sister trait that we'll talk about afterwards in the mandible, but let's finish up on our maxilla first. So the peristyle is going to be either a little pit or to a full-blown cusp that, if it's present, would sit on the mesiobuccal cusp in the maxillary dentition. So it's scored on all 3 teeth, but we're going to look at the first molar initially. So it starts off with this, once again, smooth surface if it's not there in that 0, ranges to a pit, which is the first score, and then slowly kind of grows from a little bulge all the way up to potentially a full-blown cusp, or even something that resembles a supernumerary or peg tooth. So we have quite a few ranges in variation there as to how we can score this. The pit variant might be a separate trait, but this is something that those of us doing research in dental morphology are still looking into. It's kind of a question that we have out there. And in terms of its global frequencies, most populations have this trait at less than 10%. So it's not overly helpful for ancestry estimation, but it's good to know what the variants of this trait look like. So that way we're not kind of scoring it as something else. So now we're looking at the same trait, the peristyle, in the second and third molars. So peristyle, if it's going to be expressed, is usually most fully expressed on third molars. So if you know even a little bit about teeth, third molars tend to be a little weird and are why we're not focusing on them too much. But this tends to be where we see kind of the biggest variations in what a peristyle can look like. So we've got some pictures here where on that maxillary second molar, it is kind of its own little cusp sticking out there. It's not too big, but it's definitely something you would want to pay attention to. And then on that third molar that's pictured, it actually looks like it's heading more towards a supernumerary tooth than another cusp. So now we are shifting into the mandible and mandibular traits with this. So we're still looking at the buccal surface. We're not back on the occlusal surface just yet. And protostylid is essentially this kind of sister trait to peristyle in that they have similar expressions, but they are essentially expressed a little differently and obviously have separate descriptions to go with that. So protostylid is once again scored on all three molars within the lower teeth, just like peristyle is scored on all three teeth in the maxillary dentition. And the expressions once again range from kind of nothing. You can see in the zero picture on that first molar that it's really smooth on that buccal surface, to a pit, to a cusp. Now, the big difference between protostylid and peristyle, besides the fact that they're in different arcades, is that protostylid essentially doesn't become fully as largely expressed, if you will, as peristyle does. So you're not going to get something that resembles a supernumerary tooth with protostylid. Now, what's interesting with this is that the pit form of protostylid is very likely its own trait. So there's been some studies that look into it within Native American and Latinx or Hispanic groups. And that seems to be the expression that essentially starts to distinguish some of these populations from other groups. So there are, low grade frequencies of this trait in many groups, but that pit form is at its highest frequencies in groups out of North Asia. So, like I said, our Native American and Latinx or Hispanic groups. And you can see on these pictures, we have our little pit form there. It's the one on that lower first molar, and then different gradations that are presented here as well. And now we're going to shift it back to Heather for some more occlusal traits.
Okay, so I'd like to talk to you about cusps 5, 6, and 7, and all what these traits have in common is that they're all about size. Their relative size to what's around them, with cusp 7 being special and different because of where it's placed. And so let's take a look first at cusp 5 in the first molar. And what we're interested in here is whether there's a small cusp at the distal margin of the occlusal surface, and if there is, what size it is. So the location we're looking is right here at kind of the end of this central groove that runs mesiodistal in the middle of the tooth. And so we compare, so here this is a zero expression, there's nothing there. But if there was, we'd be comparing it with these two cusps. And this is what makes this a little different than those maxillary characteristics that we're looking at, is we're going to compare the size of cusp 5 when it's seen to both the distal buccal and distal lingual cusps. So here we're looking at like a mid-range expression, cusp level 3. So this is a case where that fifth cusp, that looks like a triangle at the back of the tooth, is about 1/3 to 1/2 the size of those two cusps on either side of it. And then we can look here and see that that cusp 5 is really, really large. You'll look next to cusp 5 heading lingually to the right of your screen, and you'll see another cusp. That's cusp 6. We're going to talk about that in just a second, but that wouldn't be what we would use for comparison. So we're going to use the main distal lingual and distal buccal cusps. So if you see two cusps back there, Then if you see one cusp, you can assume it's cusp 5. And if you see two cusps there, you can say cusp 5 is the more buccal of the two. Let's take a look in at cusp 5 expression on the second molar. Here, again, a 0 expression. That groove is just continuous. That's a really simple tooth, which is something you would tend to find more in a second molar. And we can see, if we compare it to those cusps, there's nothing there. And then if we look in the middle of the screen, or that area, the middle expression, you'll see that's a score 3. So we're going to look at cusp 5 as that triangular area in the back of the tooth and say, okay, this looks to be about 1/3 to 1/2. It's closer to 1/3 the size of the distal buccal and distal lingual cusps. And then down at the bottom is a ginormous, a really big expression where cusp 5 is bigger than the distal buccal and about the same size as distal lingual. So let's take a look at cusp 6 now. The only time you're going to score 6 is when you have two cusps at the back of the tooth, in the distal portion of the tooth. If you have one cusp, we assume it's cusp 5. If you have two, then that means you have 5 and 6. And we're going to score cusp 6 in relation to its size as compared to cusp 5. So cusp 6 is this one that's more on the lingual surface, and we compare it to cusp 5. So in an expression 1, basically it's 1/3 or less the size of cusp 5, where here it's 1/3 to 1/2. And then in this particular expression, you can see that cusp 6 is actually bigger than cusp 5. Same kind of thing, it's relatively rare to be finding significant size cusps in a second molar, but you can, especially in Asian-derived populations and also in African-derived populations. So here is that cusp 6. This is a really worn tooth, but I still think you can see it, and we compare it to cusp 5 and see that it's there, but it's a lot smaller, about 1/3 of the size. Here we compare them score 2, meaning that it's 1/3 or so about the size of cusp 5. And then down at the bottom, you can see that cusp 6 is actually a little bit bigger than cusp 5. And now, moving on to cusp 7, we're going to look in a different location. So if you look at the top of your screen, you can see that we've moved from the distal side of the tooth to the lingual side of the tooth. And so we're going to be looking between the two main lingual cusps and looking at expression there. So this is a small cusp that can occur on that lingual side, but it's on the occlusal surface. So this is the place we're going to look. This is a 0 score because the groove continues all the way with no interruption. But if we look here, you can see kind of sitting on the side of the more mesial cusp is an extra little cusp. So you can see it's small and it kind of leans towards cusp 2, or the mesiolingual cusp. And then I wanted to provide you with two different expressions of a large cusp 7. We're only going to score up to 4 here. And so here we have kind of on the left, an expression that looks almost like a piece of pie, right? It's a triangle that sits between those two primary cusps. Whereas on the other side, it looks less like a piece of pie and more like just a regular cusp that's got, a groove and a ridge to it as well. And I think, to me, it looks, these tend to look like maybe that additional cusp displaces the two primary lingual cusps, and that's a good way to think about cusp 7. The bigger it is, the more it displaces the other two cusps. Then let's take a quick look at M2. So here, that's a 1 score because there's that faint ridging that's like alongside and part of cusp 2. And then larger expressions here, forming its own cusp more in the midline. And at this point, I'll turn it back over to Becca.
All right. So we are going to look at two more traits on this occlusal surface of the mandibular molars. And the first of those is the anterior fovea. And this is only scored on that first mandibular molar. And part of why this is that this trait occurs less frequently on the first molar, but occurs very, very frequently on the second and third molars, to the point that it's not particularly helpful to score on those teeth. So this trait can sometimes be a little bit tricky, in part because you have to actually have a depression that runs between the two mesial cusps, so the mesiobuccal and the mesiolingual cusps. That's got to be uninterrupted. So sometimes people find this trait a little bit tricky. So hopefully the pictures and the descriptions here will help make that a little clearer when you're looking at this in casework. So in the picture that's a 0, you can see that that little depression that's between the mesiobuccal and mesiolingual cusps is not uninterrupted. There's actually a ridge that's running through it. So that one's a 0. The one that's a 2 is a little bit more of a deeper depression that's going through there. And the one that's a 3 is a little bit deeper than that. So this trait is scored 0 to 4, with 4 being the most pronounced expression of this. So it's going to be this deeper, wider groove stretching across the mesiobuccal and mesiolingual cusps. So typically, as long as you're looking for that actual depression, you should be okay in scoring that. This trait can get tricky when teeth are worn. So that's something that you want to look out for as well when you're using these methods in your own work. Typically, anterior foveae presence is higher in groups with European and African ancestry than others. So those are typically going to be the groups that you'll see it more prominently in. And this last occlusal trait that we're going to talk about is actually my favorite. It's the deflecting wrinkle. And despite its name, it is not particularly wrinkly, but it is indeed deflecting. So where we're looking at this trait is on the mesiolingual cusp, and we're looking for a ridge there, and whether it's running straight or if it's running back towards the distal lingual cusp. So looking on that lingual side of the tooth. So in the 0, you can see that there's no ridge. The tooth doesn't have any ridge on that mesiolingual cusp. In the 1, you have a ridge there, but it runs straight. A 2, though we don't have it pictured here, starts to deflect a little bit, so it turns a little bit more towards that distal lingual cusp, but doesn't quite touch it all the way. And in the 3, as you can see highlighted there with the black arrow, it actually looks like a little boot. So that ridge deflects all the way back and touches the distal lingual cusp. It actually looks like it's kicking it a little bit. So that is the full expression of a deflecting wrinkle. And like Carabelli's trait, pretty much all groups that we've studied thus far have some frequency of this trait, but the highest frequencies tend to be in groups with Asian ancestry, including those in the Americas, while the lowest frequencies that we see globally are in European groups. So just kind of an idea of where that would fall in terms of using this trait for potential ancestry estimation. Okay, so we are now shifting from occlusal traits to looking back at the buccal surface and looking at a trait called enamel extensions. So we are going to look at this in both the maxillary and mandibular molars, but we'll start with the maxillary dentition. So one of the potentially tricky things about this trait is that if teeth have been exposed to the elements, if they've been in a collection for a while, been handled quite a bit, sometimes that enamel that's sitting on the roots can potentially wear or chip off. But if you've got this trait, it can be incredibly helpful in ancestry estimation. So if we look at this picture that's labeled 0 first, you can see that the enamel kind of runs straight up against the roots. It doesn't kind of continue down that root at all. In the 1, you can see there's just a little bit of enamel that's dipped onto the root. A 2 kind of extends a little bit beyond that, and a 3, which is the maximum expression of this trait, goes further down and kind of dips almost under the root, if you will. Typically, we're looking at more than 4 millimeters in length for this, and we have two kind of expressions as to what a 3 would look like in maxillary dentition. Now, there are times where the enamel maybe doesn't quite continue down the roots, but does end up looking at an enamel pearl. So we have one pictured here. They're really cute. And those are just these little dots of enamel that we don't score, but you can kind of note within there. The highest frequencies of enamel extensions are in groups with Asian ancestry, including those in the Americas. So this is helpful if you've got Hispanic or Latinx individuals, and tends to be the lowest in European and African groups. So in looking at this trait on the mandibular molars, it scored the same, 0 to 3, essentially looking at the length that enamel is extending onto the root. So we've got our little pearl at the bottom in that photo where, once again, that enamel didn't extend onto the root in a linear fashion that we would score for an enamel extension, but we can still note that pearl is there. And you can see in the 0 that we have here, it's pretty flat right across the bottom of that enamel surface. In the 1, it's extending just a little bit, the 2 a little bit beyond that, and that 3 kind of continues and looks like it would go almost around the root of that tooth. So once again, I said we expect to see this trait in higher frequencies in groups with Asian ancestry, and of course, those in the Americas as well with that trait. And I think we're going to hand it over to Heather to help get us started in closing out.
I'll just say what I always say about enamel extensions is in a lot of expression, especially in the mandible, it looks like the tooth is wearing tighty whities. So to kind of wrap up, again, the reason you look at these characteristics in forensic anthropology is for the estimation of population affinity. And Becca and I have kind of given you some ideas about which populations you might see these in, but that is not to say that you should see expressions and then say, oh, it belongs to this group, or oh, it belongs to that group. Just like all the other methods that we should be using for both population affinity and for kind of everything else in forensic anthropology, there should be a statistical approach that's associated with error. Now, there is significant historical and also recent research that indicates that dental traits are heritable and neutral. And so because of that, they are useful for population affinity. There are two primary tools in use at the moment that have this kind of like statistical approach that's associated with error. And one is a paper I wrote in 2013, and also Scott et al.'s 2018 paper that presents a web-based program, ASU-DAS. ASU-DAS stands for Arizona State University Dental Anthropology System. So I'll talk a little bit about my paper, and then Becca can talk about the Scott work. This is a published paper that provides for the user a bunch of regression equations that they can compare the observations that they see in an unknown individual to data that's been gathered from reference individuals. And the reference samples are contemporary African American, European, and Hispanic Americans. So the way this works is that you look at the traits that are valuable for comparing, for detecting affinity with these groups, and look at them in your own individual, and then work it just like any other discriminative function. And it's all described in the paper pretty simply. The old school interface here, the fact that it's a published document, causes limitations to the value of this paper. And those limitations are mostly associated with whether, if you have incomplete information in the individual that you are interested in studying. So even though I provided you a variety of different equations to use, if you're missing the very most core tooth, then you can't apply the method. If you do have a variety of different teeth available to you for study, then it's a fairly simple thing to do. You use one equation to first tell if an individual is African American or European, or Hispanic American. I use Hispanic because here in New Mexico, that's the term that's most commonly used. And then if the individual seems to be African American or European American, you do a second equation to determine if they are African American or European American. And there's associated error estimates, and all of those kinds of things are present there. The primary limitation, again, being the fact that this is a published and inflexible form. Becca?
So this is the interface for the updated, I call it RASUDAS, but RASUDAS interface that runs on R and produces Bayesian outputs, essentially based on the data that you have. So the original interface that is based on the 2018 article by Scott et al. Only had 20 or 21 traits. And like Heather had mentioned with her paper, only relied on the core teeth. And the original method was sampled and kind of tested with 150 individuals on essentially more than 30,000 individuals of 7 different continental groups to provide an ancestry estimation. The big problem with this is that it's not based on modern data. It's more historical or bioarchaeological data. So it's not quite ready for a forensic use, but can at least maybe get you in a ballpark. So this updated interface that we have pictured here has been for like a couple of years in the works, and of course COVID had slowed some things down, but now this updated interface allows you to input additional teeth, additional scores, so that way if you don't have those core teeth, you're not kind of out of luck. There are other teeth that it can rely on to provide a posterior probability of what continental group the individual in question looks at. You can also upload batch data to this interface as well. Probably another kind of downside to this is that it doesn't provide any kind of graphical output. It'll give you a chart with your posterior probabilities, state which groups you ran it against and who it most likely belongs to. But like I said, it's more for bioarchaeological context than forensic contexts at this time. We'll go back to Heather.
Okay, so I wanted to take this opportunity to let you guys know about a new tool that's going to be coming, and for the first time I actually have a date that I can tell you about when it's going to be coming. So this will be a new web-based tool that hopefully will take the best parts of the work that Scott built on in 2018, and the best parts of previous work that I've done, and then best parts of some other web-based tools that have come out in forensics, and kind of combine it into one single tool for using dental morphology in population affinity. So this tool is going to look a little bit more like TA3 for those of you who have played with that. So there'll be a lot of pictures of expressions, and a lot of like, does it look more like this one than that one? You know, so really simple data collection approaches. It's going to be based on about 6,000 individuals, and those 6,000 will include contemporary populations from the US mostly, but also from Mexico and a few other places, as well as historic and prehistoric samples. And you'll be able to say, okay, I just want to compare with the contemporary populations, or I want to compare with other groups as well. And so it's going to be simple to use, and then work statistically, probably giving you a couple of different choices. One of those will be discriminant functions, but then probably some like machine learning approaches like neighbor joining, or maybe some other stuff too. We're working out still those statistics. And so I'm going to predict that this will be mid-2024 or before that this tool will be available to you. So please watch for it. I'm excited to get it out to you. And with that, both Becca and I would like to thank you for your time and attention while you listened, and also thank the Forensic Technology Center of Excellence for this opportunity to share this information with you, and SOFA as well for putting out the request to us for this presentation. I'd like to thank the museums and others who provided the images, and Suzanne Dowey, who's the illustrator, whose amazing drawings you've seen through this, and then some funders that have helped us to gather this data. And finally, if you have any questions and you'd like to contact Becca or I with those questions, our email addresses here are on the screen, and we'd be happy to hear from you. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. I'm Michaela Askleith, and I'm a forensic scientist at RTI International, and I'll be your moderator for today. Thank you so much, Heather and Becca, for your informative presentation. We're going to go ahead and get started with the Q&A today. If you have any questions, feel free to just put them in the Q&A pod. All right. So the first question we have from a attendee is the hypocone the cusp that gives molars that Y5 pattern? I'll go ahead and give that to Heather.
Well, thanks for the question. Actually, no, the hypocone is in the maxillary molar, and Y5 molars are mandibular molars. And they are so common because the hypoconulid, which is the fifth cusp in the mandibular molars, is almost always present on M1. And so that's the Y5 is mandibular and includes the hypoconulid. I hope that helps.
Thank you. All right. Next question we have asks, I'll go ahead and give this to Becca. Is the expression of these traits usually bilateral? I'm assuming the person was talking about these traits in general. If the person who asked this wants to specify, that would also be great.
Yeah, so kind of building on that, it kind of depends on the trait. So sometimes full expressions of a peristyle or a protostylid, for example, will be unilateral instead of bilateral. But even things like a Carabelli's cusp, for example, can be smaller on one side versus another. So they are not necessarily going to be equal bilaterally.
Okay, thank you. All right, Heather, we have another question asking, this one is, would you use Carabelli's trait for ancestry estimation since it's found in other populations than European?
Well, that's a good question. So yes, Carabelli's trait is found all over the world. However, it is like the really high expressions of it, the big separate cusp and stuff like that is much more common in Europeans. But regardless, there's not any trait that I would use singular or even like one or two traits that I would use for ancestry estimation. Like I could imagine a situation where Carabelli's cusp, especially at high levels of expression, is included in regression to estimate population affinity in a bunch of different groups, and where they, especially at high expression, it would be informative that somebody was of European ancestry, or at low expressions or no expression that if they're not of European ancestry, but that would have to be in combination with a bunch of other traits. So I hope that helps.
Yeah, no, that yeah, I think that definitely helps, knowing that a variety of traits need to be used together. And I'm sure there's no magic number of, a certain number of traits to define population affinity.
No, of course, it really depends on, how big the difference in frequency is among the populations. It's just like in genetics, we have these ancestry informative markers, and the greater the difference in trait expression or in allele frequency in different groups, the fewer aims you need. And it's just the same thing in dental morphology. But what gives genetics its power is that it has a lot of different data points. And this is actually part of, even though dental morphology is a lot fewer than genetics, it's still more than a lot of other characteristics that we look at. And so it provides that kind of strength. Why not include as much information? And that way, the more information you have, even if probabilities are small in each individual trait, they add up together to make a powerful estimate of population affinity.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and then Becca, kind of as a follow-up to that, another person has asked, are the traits evolving to other populations where you can't label them?
So I'm kind of guessing that this question is more about, thinking about ancestry long term, where we mentioned that the RAS-UDAS interface, is more bioarchaeological populations versus modern. So kind of building on what Heather had said, you just have to be careful about kind of what traits you're using, making sure that you're using enough. Are you scoring them correctly? Rather than kind of thinking about these traits like randomly appearing in one population. As we noted, teeth are really conservative. It takes them a long time to change, but when they do, you want to kind of capture that within your data collection. So this isn't, something I'd expect to see radically different frequencies of, certain traits in populations in like 10 years. But, if we're tracking things over a longer period of time, those will be when we see those differences and similarities appearing.
Okay, great. Thanks. And since I guess we're already on the topic of, population affinity, should I use dental morphology in addition, or instead of other metrics like craniometrics?
Well, I'll take that. I think, in forensic casework, it's really useful to have multiple lines of evidence. And so I don't necessarily see dental morphology as a replacement for craniometrics or even cranial non-metrics, but as a complement. The only time I would think that it could be a replacement, it is when there's no bone available, or maybe there's some cranial elements that are present, but they're so few, or they're broken or they're warped. And, in practice, this happens all the time, where you might not have cranial elements that are reliable, but you have dental traits that are reliable.
Thank you. And then also, are there any methods for estimating population affinity using the deciduous teeth? Heather, if you want to go ahead and answer that as well, since it's still on population affinity.
Sure, I'll take that. So there is a paper that was published by Lauren Lease and Ed Harris years ago that is useful for estimating population affinity between African Americans and European Americans. There may be other methods. That's the only one that I'm familiar with. I think this is a really rich area of research for the future. And in fact, deciduous teeth should be really much better associated with population affinity. The morphology should be more useful than permanent teeth, given that they are developing in a protected environment and there's going to be less environmental influence, even less than there is on the permanent teeth. But there has been very little work done on this, and so I would really love to see that work done in the future.
Yeah, that would be great to have more research out there on that topic. All right, I'll give this one to Becca, but this person is asking if someone has a filling, are there any traits which are more likely to be missing as a result of this?
So of course it depends where the filling is, right? Though I will say for the protostylid in the mandibular teeth, a lot of dentists love to fill in that little pit form because if you don't clean it well, it's basically a gateway to a carious lesion. But some other things, if they're on the occlusal surface, you've got to look out for things like anterior fovea, deflected wrinkle being taken out in the mandibular teeth. And of course, likewise in the maxillary dentition for those traits. So it all really depends on where that filling is, but just have to be careful within your own casework and kind of what you're seeing.
Yeah. And I know, everyone's teeth can be highly variable, and that's probably a very variable trait. So, all right. I'll give this one to Heather. A person is asked, in the new 2024 database, are the buccal pits treated as a separate trait to score or still incorporated within the other trait sequence?
I don't know yet. We are in the process of we are at the beginning of the process of figuring out which trait expressions are going to be the most informative and under what circumstances we can drop out some trait expressions that aren't really super useful for population affinity, or maybe move things around. So I wish I had a good answer to your question, and I don't.
Do you have an estimate of maybe when you would know, or?
This question of whether the buccal pit is a separate trait from the protostyle or peristyle is of interest to a lot of dental anthropologists, but I'm not especially one of them, because I don't think that this particular thing is going to be that useful in population affinity. And so it will probably be solved at the same time everything is. So I would say watch, somewhere in the first or second quarter of 2024. I don't think we'll produce a paper before then about that, because it's there's people who are working on this issue a lot, and I'm not one of them.
All right, no problem. We'll just have to keep a lookout for that later on. All right, and I'll give this one to Becca. An attendee has asked to follow up on the Carabelli's question: if you have multiple lines of evidence, how do you weigh the dental trait? And how do you report your confidence in a report using that trait?
So since I am not a board certified forensic anthropologist, I might actually defer that one back to Heather, just for how that should be weighed, essentially in a case report setting.
Sure. So even now, while you until this new method comes out, the solution is to use a method that is associated with a confidence interval. And so our ASU-DAS provides you that information, and so does the paper I wrote in 2013, or the one in 2005, which we didn't talk about, but a confidence interval is what you need, or some kind of probability associated with the method that you're using. And really, if you're doing forensic work, you shouldn't be using a method that isn't associated with probabilities and known errors. And so then let's say you have a set of information from cranial measurements, and you have a set of information from dental morphology, and they disagree. That can happen. I hope it doesn't happen often, but it can happen. I would look at those statistics that are related to probability, typicality, and confidence. And then I would also probably think a little bit about which one had the most data available. And also, did the reference populations in the method that you're using match the populations that are in your area, the likely populations this individual would come from? And all of those are probably going to help you in writing your case reports, so that you can explain, why you're describing somebody the way they are. But when I write my case reports, I put the confidence interval or the probability of every method I used into that report.
No, that's really great. And you can always, refer back to that in the future. Since we're kind of on the subject of, case reports and casework, Becca, what advice do you have for people interested in utilizing dental morphology in casework, but just want more training?
Yeah, so step one, find a tooth nerd. So the Dental Anthropology Association is actually working on a list, and this will go for both kind of students interested in more information, as well as professionals, a list of essentially people working in dental morphology and where they're located. And I would encourage you to start making connections with them, start kind of reaching out and building those networks, because, especially if you want to get a group of people together, those of us that love dental morphology and sharing that information would be happy to do trainings, whether they be on Zoom, in person, things like that, just kind of finding what that middle ground is. We are happy to share that knowledge and want people to be more comfortable using dental morphology. And the only way to do that is to spread the word, share the wealth.
And for students especially, do you have any like particular places where they can find information?
Yeah, so it's along those same lines.
Mhm.
Keep a lookout for that Dental Anthropology Association list that we'll have coming out soon. We just needed, memberships to be updated and whatnot, see who's active, to kind of get that published. And for students especially who maybe are interested in pursuing graduate work within dental morphology, look out for institutions that have graduate programs, that have people that do this work. That way you're ensuring that you're being trained by people who know what they're doing, know that variation to look out for, and just kind of being aware of what they can do with that.
Yeah, for sure. All right, I don't see any more questions in the Q&A pod, so if any other attendees have any more questions, feel free to just put them in there. Heather and Becca, do you have any thoughts to share from your presentation today?
I just say, like, if you find yourself collecting dental morphological data and you're unsure, take your time, orient yourself to the tooth, read the descriptions, and don't gloss over it. Don't just think to yourself, imagine you were learning craniometrics for the first time and you needed to learn where all those landmarks are. It takes the same amount of effort and time to do dental morphology as it does craniometrics or cranial non-metrics. It doesn't take more effort and time, but it doesn't take less either. So I think approaching teeth the same way you did when you were first learning the skeleton is a good way to do it. Becca, what do you think?
I just hope that we're making teeth less scary by talking about them more frequently, especially in a forensic anthropological setting. There's so much more to it than just 2 or 3 traits. There's a lot more that can be incredibly informative. You just have to know what you're looking at, and don't be afraid to ask for help as you're learning and orienting yourself to these traits and their descriptions. You've got a resource out there of tooth nerds that are happy to help.
Oh, it looks like another question just came in. So whoever wants to take this one, is it of value to study the Turner dental cast set from ASU?
Becca, that's a question for you.
So I would say they are incredibly beneficial, especially the updated system. I actually have a box sitting on my shelf over here that I keep hoping to find time to train my students on as well, especially if you are just getting started. These casts are incredibly informative and give you a really solid outline of what these variations look like in these traits. Also, the purchase of every one of these bone clone sets of casts takes that money right back to the Dental Anthropology Association to help support student scholarship. So you're doing good work all around by utilizing those casts. And they're a really great place to start. Just make sure that you are using them in conjunction with the trait descriptions. They are a matched set in that way. Do not just rely on one or the other, especially if you're just learning. Those casts are really helpful for that, but do not just kind of walk into a setting blind with just those and without the trait descriptions to go with them.
Good to know. All right. See. Doesn't appear like we have any more questions. Again, if anyone has any last questions, feel free to place them in the chat now. But really appreciate both our presenters today for your contributions and your lovely presentation. And thank you everyone for attending today's webinar.
Thank you, everybody. I really appreciate your time.
Thank you so much for listening to tooth discussions.
As you depart, we kindly ask that you take a minute or two to complete our post-webinar survey. The link will be pasted in the chat and also appear as you exit the Zoom room. Your feedback helps us improve our webinars and continue providing the best experience possible. Lastly, we encourage you to check out our social media profiles, including Twitter, LinkedIn, and Facebook. You can find those links on the webinar page. There are also links to the Just Science Podcast SoundCloud and a link to subscribe to the FTCOE newsletter. Like, follow, or subscribe to stay up to date with everything the FTCOE is doing in support of the forensic community. Thank you again for attending, and we hope everyone has a great day.